W.J.T. Mitchell, born March 24 in 1942, is the Gaylord Donnelly Distinguished Service Professor of English and Art History at the University of Chicago. He's also the editor of Critical Inquiry and contributes to the journal October. Professor Mitchell is known especially for his work on the relations of visual and verbal representations in the context of social and political issues. During his editorship, Critical Inquiry, a quarterly devoted to critical theory in the arts and human sciences, has published issues on canon formation, gender, race and writing, public art, politics and poetic value, metaphor, psychoanalysis, identity politics, pluralism, new directions in art history, questions of evidence, and many other special topics. Mitchell received his BA from Michigan State University in 1963, his MA and PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 1968. He taught in the Ohio State University before moving to Chicago. He's a member of the American Philosophical Society, the British Academy, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2017. A scholar and theorist of media, visual art and literature, Mitchell is associated with the emergent fields of visual culture and iconology. Iconology uncovers the cultural, social, and historical background of themes and subjects in the visual arts. It is, in other words, the study of images across the media. Mitchell has been the recipient of numerous awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship and the Maury Prize in Art History given by the College Art Association of America. In 2003, he received the University of Chicago's prestigious Faculty Award for Excellence in Graduate Teaching. His monographs, Iconology in 1986 and Picture Theory in 1994, focus on media theory and visual culture. He draws on ideas from Sigmund Freud and Karl Marx to demonstrate that, essentially, we must consider pictures to be living things. He rethinks visual culture as a form of life and in light of digital media. Mitchell traces the interest in visual culture to his early work on William Blake and his then burgeoning interest in developing a science of images. His collection of essays, What Do Pictures Want?, from 2005 won the same year the Modern Language Association's prestigious James Russell Lowell Prize. Tom Mitchell's last book, Mental Traveler, A Father, a Son, and a Journey Through Schizophrenia, came out last September. Gabriel Mitchell was diagnosed with schizophrenia at age 21 and died by suicide 18 years later. Gabriel's declared ambition was to transform schizophrenia from a death sentence to a learning experience, and madness from a curse to a critical perspective. Shot through with love and pain, Mental Traveler shows how Gabriel drew his father into his quest for enlightenment within madness. Tom Mitchell will now perform his real-time talk, Present Tense 2020, an Iconology of Time.
Well, thank you and welcome to this lecture in our new world. First, I want to thank the Flemish Royal Academy, its permanent secretary, Freddie Dumortier, and a whole team of people that you won't see very much during this lecture, but they are behind the scenes. We've been meeting since yesterday to try to make this work. So let's hope for the best. I want to thank particularly Inez Rua, Hilde van Gelder, Bart Verschaffen, Chris Brown, who is operating our technology, and Annemie van Kerkhoven, who just gave this incredibly generous introduction. I felt the whole timeline of my life flashing before my eyes. I am not going to be reading a paper today, but my introduction will be partly read. As Annemie just explained to you, my newest book is a memoir about the life of my son, Gabriel Mitchell, who suffered from schizophrenia for 20 years. Gabriel's life project merged with my own. He wanted to take madness, all forms of it, all times and places of it, into a framework for understanding the human condition, rather than something that exiles, excludes, or puts the mad at some distance from us, but brings it into our midst as a framework for critique and comprehension. So Mental Traveler tells his story, but it is also the basic argument of the book that we are all mental travelers on this planet. And we all have our issues. None of us have perfectly rational minds. All of us are part of this journey. And that's why I've been guided throughout this whole inquiry into time by Nietzsche's remark: insanity in individuals is somewhat rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule. Since my topic today is time, and we clearly live in crazy times, it seems like a good moment to inquire into the nature of an epoch and into the nature of craziness as a temporal phenomenon. This is to put my cards on the table to ask all the old questions about the nature of time, such as what is time, but accompanied by an acknowledgement that we're going to have to settle for an iconology of time. And by iconology of time, it's very simple. Images of time, which include not only faces and figures and forms, but figures in the sense of verbal metaphors, figures in the sense of numbers, since time is always about numbers and about mapping numbers in space. It's always about shapes, as George Kubler said long ago. The shape of time is uneven, filled with waves, undulations, and breaks. So the iconology of time tries to take into account all of the things we can mean by shapes, forms, figures, and faces. I'm not going to be reading a paper because, in a sense, that would put my words in the past, words that I wrote yesterday or 2 months ago. I will try to make this up as I go along. You can read the paper soon in Critical Inquiry. It'll be published there soon, but this is not that paper. It's speaking of today, the time we're in right now. Clearly, it's a historic moment of political uncertainty and anxiety, often compared to other moments of crises. For instance, 1 century ago, the 1918 Spanish flu, the denouement of World War I, the crises, especially in the United States, around race relations in the early 1920s. It's as if we have come around on a cycle of return to things that were present 1 century ago. In 1920, or more precisely 1919, Abby Warburg, who is largely the inspiration for much of my work, the great art historian, tried to compile an atlas during World War I an atlas of the Great War, to try to comprehend it, to produce what Walter Benjamin would call a constellation of images that would help you understand that present. The project, in some sense, either he was already going crazy or it drove him crazy. It remains in boxes in the Warburg Institute in London. It never came to pass. His Builder Atlas of Human Emotions did get created. So you may think of this as my own crazy project, an attempt to create a Builder Atlas of the present, of 2020. Now, surely the first thing we would have to acknowledge in an iconology of the present, in the most literal sense, would be the peculiar nature of our presence here to each other. And present not in reality or not bodily and literally, but present as images to each other. It's a new world in which the regime of images has penetrated life. It's been doing that for a long time, but it's now penetrated it to a much deeper level. So one question this paper asks is, what does it mean that we are now convening in this kind of way? I imagine many of you are teaching this way on Zoom, teaching by remote control, by virtual presence. Are we more or less present to each other here and now in this virtual lecture hall than we would have been if I were in Brussels right now? Of course, something has been lost. There's no doubt about that. I will miss going to dinner with all my dear friends here in Brussels this evening. But let's not focus on that. What are we gaining by this mode in the present? Now, of course, I'm not here to convince you that this is a crazy time. You know that already. My aim is rather to specify and analyze the particular and singular character of this moment in history. I want to find out whether it helps us think about the question of time and the question of madness and something beyond. So this is the last you're going to see of me for a while. I'm going to start sharing my screen and proceed to show you some slides. I want to begin with some of what you might call the Bartlett's familiar quotations about time that almost anyone who writes about time has to take these on. St. Augustine, usually the canonical beginning. Augustine's remark that the present is real in a way in which the past and the future are not. But even more famously, Augustine's acknowledgement that the ontology of time is an unanswerable question. As he says, what is time? If nobody asks me, I know, but if I were desirous to explain it to one that should ask me, plainly I know not. And then there's that mythical Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. Certainly we do. Apparently the Chinese have nothing to do with this curse. For some reason it's been attributed to them. But it's something people say, and why they attribute it to China is unclear to me. But finally, I think if there is a keynote to the whole talk, it is Nietzsche's remark in Beyond Good and Evil. Insanity in individuals is somewhat rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule. So I want that to be thought of, taking out for the moment the groups, parties, and nations, and focusing on the idea of the epoch. What is an epoch? Epoch is connected usually to moments in time or periods. The epoch is like an era. It might be signaled by an event, certainly an event like 9/11 defined a new epoch in the United States. 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is where we usually cite a date as the beginning of an epoch or the end of an era. And clearly we are in an epoch now. In the US, they're often defined by something as simple as presidential regimes, the rule of parties. So we are in the epoch of Donald Trump. And more broadly, as a planetary issue, we are in the epoch of endangered democracies and the rise in many countries around the world of authoritarian regimes, neo-fascist regimes, corrupt and hollowed out democracies in which some of elections still take place, but they're meaningless. Epochs can extend to larger periods of time, geological time, in the instance. So all of these are part of what defines the epoch. But there is a very closely connected concept, the epoch, which is a slightly different notion of time. It's much more associated with phenomenology, with direct experience, and in ancient philosophy, with skepticism and the act of refraining from any conclusion for or against anything as the decisive step. In that sense, epoch and epoch are direct opposites. If the epoch is defined by a decision, say an election, the onset of a war, a catastrophe, epoch is the suspension of decision. So where are we today in that respect? I would suggest we are in an epoch, at least in the US, waiting for the epochal decision, which will occur exactly 13 days from today. So that is our present. The present is always a kind of accordion concept. That is, it expands and contracts. Is the present today? Is the present this hour, the time of this lecture? Is the present this week? Or is the present the very difficult to see horizon of the present pandemic, which the entire world is experiencing simultaneously? All those scales of time correspond to whatever we might want to call the present. I very much like William James's definition of the present as the short duration of which we are immediately and incessantly sensible, and the specious present which accompanies it, which has a vaguely vanishing backward and forward fringe, a saddleback from which we look in two directions into time. So where are we sitting today? We are all over the world, sitting and looking into the past and future from this present moment in different directions. And I want to compare this position with Walter Benjamin's famous Angel of History, his reading of Paul Klee's Angelus Novus. As the Angel of History, with his face turned toward the past, you all know, I'm sure, these remarks by Benjamin on the painting. A storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. This storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. Benjamin's Angel of History is, of course, conjured up by him in 1940 as World War II is breaking out. as fascism has firmly taken over in Germany, as a world war is descending on the planet, it is an incredibly pessimistic view. And of course, in a few months, Benjamin will commit suicide. There is no future, there is no future you can see. It's a deep and abiding image of the perspective of the historian, who, in the words of, I think it's Henry Ford, said, the only thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. I want to propose, for my own angel of history, a rather different figure, much more humble, not exactly an angel. And the reason I chose him was because of William James's account of the specious present as a saddleback from which we look in two directions into time. This is an Italian peasant painted by Giuseppe Crespi in the early 18th century, based on an Italian folk tale about Cacaseno. Cacaseno, as his name suggests, is he who shits on the face of the sovereign. He is the insolent fool or clown, that form of craziness that verges on satire, burlesque, parody, caricature. And that, I think, is one of the important images of time, not just the Angelus Novus of the sublime catastrophe of history, but a kind of awkward peasant sitting backward on his horse, looking both into the future and contemplating the past at the same time. So when you think of my own standpoint with regard to time, think of me as Cacaseno, the fool. The first thing I think Cacaseno notices, since he can swivel around in his saddle, he can see in all directions. It's not easy to see the future. As Yogi Berra once said famously, it's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future. But one thing we can observe is that the present is not simply defined by the most obvious global force that we have to contend with, namely the pandemic, the coronavirus. I want to suggest that there are several other viruses at play. You can say they are metaphoric viruses, and the pandemic is literally a biological virus. All of them are demics. That is, they have to do with the people, with all people, the people of the planet and the people of nations, countries, and so forth. I think of them as structural viruses that are operating at different levels. Pandemic, the biological; endemic, the cultural; infodemic, also the cultural and the psychological, the communication of messages; and ecodemic, the planetary. Let me elaborate these a little bit. The pandemic is, I think, clearly producing not only an epoch, that is a break in time. All of you, I think, have expressed the sentiment that I have, which is that the world before February, March 2020 was a completely different place, and that suddenly the world changed. For me, it changed on March 12th, 2020, when I spoke to my last class in person, a class on William Blake, and wished them all a wonderful spring term, fully expecting that we would be returning to classrooms soon. And here we are. So the pandemic produced an epoch, a break, but it also, in the meanwhile, produced an epoch, that is a time of suspension, a time when habitual actions, travel, gatherings with friends, going to a movie, going to a restaurant, all of these things are suspended while we wait. And we have no idea how long we'll be waiting. When will the decisive moment come? In the US, of course, a decisive moment, but in a different dimension in the political, will occur in 2 weeks. And we already know that that decision, the presidential election in the US, is uncertain. We have predictions, we have lots of opinion polls, but we can't know for certain. And we also know that even if Donald Trump is banished to the outer darkness, as he should be, that the world will not suddenly change back to normal. It will take a long time to release us from this state of suspension. So the temporal effect of the pandemic is double. On the one hand, the break in history. On the other hand, a suspension of history, of not knowing how to go forward. The second, and something that has coincided with the pandemic, is the upsurge of racial violence, of racist expressions and actions, especially in the US, but also registered globally. And I'm going to come back, of course, to the figure of George Floyd and the massive global uprising against racism that occurred about 3 months into the epoch of the pandemic. I call it endemic because I don't think racism is an episode like the pandemic. Pandemics come and go. The 1918 flu came and then finally went away after millions of people died. The endemic is a condition, a pathological condition that endures over long, long periods. It evolves, changes, but it is like those resident bacteria and viruses that live in every living thing. It's part of who we are, and therefore part of what we have to deal with all the time, not in just episodes. There is another endemic condition, and that's what I would call the infodemic, the world of communication we live in now, which statisticians refer to as structural viralities. That is rumor, gaslighting, conspiracy theories, paranoia. Again, this is an endemic condition accelerated by social media. And its epoch might be thought of as from the beginning of the invention of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, in the early part of this century to this year. And then finally, and the framework within which all of these have to be understood is the ecodemic, the planetary, the great acceleration of climate change, which shows no signs of abating and no signs of being dealt with in any kind of holistic and systematic way. We are in a Darwinian competition with the microbes on our planet, and they have lasted millions of years. We have only been around for about 300,000. We are also watching as 300 species per day go extinct. So our framework for thinking about the present is not merely journalism, but a kind of paleontology, as if we were looking at the passing of the dinosaurs in real time. Now, I want to illustrate these 4 structural viruses, or to show you the way they are illustrated, made visible in a variety of strategies, starting, of course, with graphs. Every day, these graphs run before us, and sometimes I pause to try to figure them all out. Some of them show how much faster the virus is gaining on us in the US than in other countries. They show not only the passage of time, but the acceleration of processes in time, as if timelines are never merely lines, not rarely straight lines. They may be framed by straight lines, but they're always undulating, curving, and serpentine waves and undulations. The most prominent at this moment, as of October 13th, just a few days ago, is the recognition that we are now heading into a third wave, and the prediction, which seems quite plausible, that this third wave is going to be bigger than the first and second. You may remember that the consciousness of the present back in March was that the first wave would be over during the summer. In fact, it peaked in July, the second wave, then began to go down as summer waned, and now, as the cool weather approaches, a third peak coming. So this is, I think, for especially American observers, but it's even worse in Europe, according to this morning's paper. The third peak is on its way. At the same time, if you thought of that trough between the first and second wave as a moment or period when the virus might wane, that was the period when the global burst of anti-racist demonstrations began across the world, centered in the US. Almost every major American city had enormous demonstrations, some of the biggest mass movements in history. People, having been told to isolate themselves from the virus, suddenly rushed together against all health restrictions to express their solidarity against racial murder. And so a timeline having to do with police shootings of Black people is also part of the timeline. As of July 14th, 2020, a kind of a 5-year summary of the percentage of Black people killed by police in the US. So race relations in this country, also subject to times, epochs, moments. The 1920s were a terrible time, that when many of the Confederate monuments were erected, when a massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma wiped out banks, hotels, and one of the most prosperous Black neighborhoods in the United States. And the Ku Klux Klan, with the connivance of the President of the United States, was marching proudly with thousands of members through the streets of New York. This is the infodemic. And I recommend highly a wonderful MIT study that appeared in the journal Science, March 9, 2018, which showed that human beings have a built-in virus, structural virality, that is in favor of false news, of disinformation, of lies, rumors, propaganda, and slander. And why is this the case? The answer turns out to be that falsehood spreads faster as a function of novelty and emotional impact, that lies have more impact, that surprise, fear, and disgust, a sense of scandal, outweigh anticipation, sadness, joy, and trust. Good news, and any journalist will tell you, this has been common sense forever among journalists. The slogan is, if it bleeds, it leads. Bad news is what we are hungry for. And that hunger leaves us vulnerable to lies about bad news. This has been known at least since the 18th century, when Jonathan Swift put it very well, falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it. The big megaphone is for lies, fake news. The tiny megaphone is for truth, which tends to get drowned out. So this is an endemic virus in the way human sociality is constructed. And it's one reason why the general cure for this has always been the notion that democracy was a way that somehow the truth would out, that people would be able to communicate and join together in language games, institutions, social movements that would be beneficial to the vast majority and that would produce a kind of equality. The other endemic condition, which has now been accelerated by the pandemic, is of course mental illness. And I'm happy to say that if you look at this, the silent generation, which is my generation, those born in 1942, around during World War II or just before, we are only 35% more prone now to mental illness. The baby boomers, the Generation X, millennials and Generation Z above all are the most prone to falling into mental illness in this time. And then finally, so that's all part of the infodemic, the way in which, for instance, gaslighting and the disruption of daily life has produced a sense that the time is out of joint and the future is so uncertain, no one can see the end of it. Trust me, I'm not going to be so pessimistic throughout this talk, but the conquest of the infodemic, I think, is going to be one of the great challenges. I think it's why the candidacy of Joe Biden is mainly about, do you want somebody who tells the truth to be the sovereign, or do you want a compulsive liar? That's in some ways the fundamental choice of this election. Then there is the planet and the question of extinction. I don't think I need to tell you again what I've already mentioned. 300 species per day disappearing. The threats to biological diversity, as Dipesh Chakrabarty has recently argued, I recommend his article in Critical Inquiry, just published, is part of what's producing the increased likelihood of pandemics, that there are no wild areas left, that we have conquered the earth so completely that now bats carrying viruses that are hundreds of thousands of years old are part of some people's diet, coming into our own ecosphere. So the ecodemic and the pandemic are deeply linked, structurally linked. It's not that there's just, they are independent variables. There is one thing, if you were looking at contemplating curves and graphs over the last months as I have, there's one graph that only shows a small deviation. That's around March 2020, late February, when the word finally leaked out after Trump had informed his stockbroker friends that there was a really bad thing coming, while not telling the American people anything about it, telling them to be complacent, everything would be fine, it would go away like a miracle. The stock market briefly crashed, but then bounced right back. And for those of us like me who live on our savings, a kind of steady curve of restoration of normality. Of course, one has to say at this point, has to quote Fred Jameson, that it's easier now to imagine the extinction of the human species than the end of capitalism. These graphs make it clear why that very pungent and pessimistic saying seems so accurate. The stock market goes on as if immune to all of the other, to the pandemic, the endemic, the infodemic. Inside information helps to make them immune. Okay, so those are the numbers and the figures, the kind of spaces of our time that I wanted to illustrate for you, part of everyday life, nothing special. I want to turn now to the question of the human face and the face of our time, because I think a lot has been focused on the face as well, as what? As the expression of human emotions, as the what Levinas called the site of subjectivity and intersubjectivity. So let me begin, and I'm sorry to have to show you the faces of the current occupant of the White House, but they tell us a lot about what the face of this moment looks like, since he is the face of the Trump epoch. One thing I found uncanny about Trump is, if I can share a story, in 2016, before the election, I was in the Palestinian territories, teaching at Birzeit University. And one evening at dinner with the arts faculty, we had a conversation, and I said, "What do you folks think about Donald Trump here in Palestine?" They burst out laughing. And I said, "What's so funny?" I said, "We love Trump." And of course, I said, "You cannot be serious." No, they said, "We love Trump because he shows the true face of America." My response, for once I thought of a good joke. I said, "That's easy for you guys to say in the safety of Palestine. We have to live with this man if he gets elected." But there is a truth to what they said, that Trump is not just this singular aberration. We have had a lot of bad presidents. We've even had some crazy presidents. We've certainly had racist presidents. We've also had some great ones, but Trump sums up something in the American character, the old stereotype of the Yankee con man. It goes back to the 19th century. H.L. Mencken foresaw perfectly 1 century ago, July 26th, 1920, that someday, for some reason, someone like Donald Trump would be elected. As he put it, "As democracy is perfected, the office of the president represents more and more closely the inner soul of the people. On some great and glorious day, the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire at last, and the White House will be occupied by a downright fool and complete narcissistic moron." I think it's notable that narcissism, which now has a technical meaning, Mencken already saw it coming. The face of the virus also perfectly captured by the New Yorker in this picture of Trump simultaneously broadcasting lies, the infodemic of misinformation and disinformation, and blindfolding himself with the mask that would filter or prevent him from speaking out and spreading the virus of lies. And now that that's become literal, that he and his followers refuse to wear masks in these demonstrations, in these rallies, and in the White House Rose Garden, have led to the White House itself becoming a hotspot of viral contamination. Alongside that is the event of the murder of George Floyd. And I'm showing this deliberately to convey the global impact, where his face became suddenly the most recognizable face of our moment. The one on the upper left was painted in Belgium, in fact. The second one in Berlin. Then there is a very familiar one from Minneapolis with his name and face, and Houston's Third Ward, where his family comes from. This is also our angel of history, because George Floyd was transformed from a police victim into a global symbol almost overnight, and no sign that he's going away. At the same time, his face begins to be elevated, circulated around the planet. Monuments to the Confederacy were going down all over the country. Here is the Belgian version. Why did George Floyd's face go viral? Why did this image, an image of truth for a change, become so powerful? I think one answer is because Breonna Taylor, I could go and recite numerous names here in Chicago. My own neighborhood has many cases of this sort. Why did George Floyd, why did it go viral? One answer is because it was mediated in a very specific way in an 8-minute and 46-second video. It was not merely an image, not merely a still image, but an image of an unbearably long moment or presence of precisely 8 minutes and 46 seconds of watching a man murdered under the knee of a police officer who kneels with the most complacent attitude, his hand in his pocket. I'm not showing any of that because it's unbearable. But it immediately led to, it's what Deleuze in his cinema book called a time image, an image in which nothing is happening. A life is simply being extinguished slowly and being silenced. So the dialectical image for this moment is, I think, as Benjamin would have put it, an image that constellates the virus with this moment of the endemic virus of racism converging in a very simple symbol, namely the mask that is there to not only prevent my breath from infecting you or your breath from infecting me, to keep us in some kind of togetherness while also preserving us from mutual contagion. But at the same, and those are George Floyd's last words. That moment is encaptured and synthesized with the virus. So it became, I mean, there are many other statements of this kind, but I think of this as the one that was most iconic, the one which converges the two pandemics most clearly. That's partly because it also builds upon a whole tradition of masking, goes back to the AIDS crisis, to the era when Cassius Clay, then Muhammad Ali, was criticized for speaking too much, talking out of turn, or in the Chicago 7 trial when Bobby Seale was shackled and gagged. All this put together made George Floyd into a monumental figure, and monumental in a very specific way. This wonderful New Yorker cover by Kadir Nelson is called Say Their Names. I would argue that this image captures a moment of, in this country, sovereignty from below, sovereignty of the undercommons, certainly sovereignty of the civil rights movement, the movement against the endemic condition of racism, caste, inequality, and white supremacy. And I would contrast it, and I think this is with the sovereign figure that, of Western polities, namely Hobbes's Leviathan, in which the masses are gathered inside the body of the sovereign. The masses of Black martyrs are here gathered inside the body of George Floyd, as if somehow that 8 minutes and 46 seconds brought back from the dead all of these previous victims. So two sovereigns, two monumental figures, one, what you might call the figure of white patriarchy. And it's important, a little detail that I think is very telling about the contrast of these two images. Hobbes's Leviathan, all of the people are facing away from us and toward the sovereign. The sovereign is the narcissistic focus, the center of adulation. George Floyd's faces and names are all looking out toward us. They are human individuals. So the face again of resistance to the virus of racism, of inequality, is, I think, captured in the wonderful contrast between these two. Meanwhile, in the last few weeks, since our beloved leader has recovered from the virus, he has been basking in the adulation of crowds. And it's clearly at this point, he knows that the chances of him winning are very little. This is only for his own pleasure. He spends most of his speeches complaining about what a persecuted figure he is, persecuted by this terrible virus that just won't go away no matter how much he wishes it would, or the fake news. Okay, well, those are the figures and faces that I wanted to focus on. Now I want to go to forms and step back from our moment to think about the recurrent shapes, what George Kubler calls the shapes of time, which are a very simple geometry in a way. I don't know if there's anything excluded by this diagram. Time is a line, time is a circle or cycle, and time is a point. We are at a point, but we are also on a line of a certain duration, and the sun will rise tomorrow. Will be a new day. So all these shapes of time, it's the fundamental geometry of time. If you put these shapes together, you come up with a synthetic image of the spiral or vortex. And this is also an incredibly ancient figure for the way time moves. That it doesn't simply move in line, circle, or point, but it brings them all together in our experience as something like a spiral tightening toward moments and instants of decision. The Romans adopted the Mithraic deity of eternal time, Aion. They put it on their coins as a symbol of the of eternitatis, the endless rule of the Roman Empire over the world. This is an angel of history who is the symbol of power, of sovereignty, holding the instruments of power in his hand and striding on the globe, but wrapped inside of the spiral. I want to take that figure of the spiral and suggest an elaboration of it in terms of our sense of the present time as a vortex. As both an epoch and an epoch, converging on a period, a moment, a still point, including what we can call, I'm going to come back to this, the split-second decision. There is a decision like an election, which, by the way, is already going on. Like something like a fifth of American voters have already voted. So It's not that the election is happening on November 3rd. That's just the end of a long moment of decision in which we don't know the outcome of. But I want to suggest 4 vectors that produce this sense of the maelstrom, the whirlpool of time. One is, of course, our own time. Each of us, everyone listening to this lecture, is at a certain point in their lifetime, young, old, middle-aged. I speak from the standpoint of old age. And as such, I want to apologize to the young generation, to all the students from Leuven and around the world who might be listening to this, for the incredible mess that my generation has made of the world. So there's our individual times. Where are we in our own timeline? And then there is the collective, the times of regimes, dynasties, revolutions. There is the vector of non-human, mechanical time, our own inventions, our own way of figuring, measuring, mapping, and graphing time, which we've already looked at. And then finally, the vector of natural time, the planetary time that we cannot control. That's why I think this is a propitious moment for reflecting on the general question of time, because all of these things are converging so obviously in this moment. So you might think of this along with my my earlier 4 dimensions of the demic, pandemic, endemic, ecodemic, and infodemic, as built in to this. So, but the spiral itself, I think, is worth pausing on as a figure of temporality. My poetic mentor, William Blake, saw the serpentine spiral not as the guarantee of the imperial destiny, the Roman Empire's eternal rule over the world, but as a figure of revolution itself. And so here in America, a Prophecy, 1793, he shows the revolutionaries, the scales tipping, and the tyrants being cast into the abyss, about to be bitten by the serpent of time. And he elaborates this even further in the book of Urizen, where he suggests that the very idea of Christian sovereignty may be subject to revolution. This is like Christ between the 2 thieves, all of them wrapped in serpents, all of them plunging into the abyss. This is from the author of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, who argued in the 1790s that Christianity, the whole fundamental basis of what we call Western civilization, was undergoing a radical upturning. And then, as I said, at the center of the vortex is a moment, often a figure. And I wanted to remind you of something or point out something that is very much a part of our sense of time in the United States. And that's this particular Supreme Court decision from 1989, Graham versus Connor. And it's about decision. The reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, rather than with the 20/20 vision of hindsight. The calculus of reasonableness must embody allowance for the fact that police officers are often forced to make split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving about the amount of force that is necessary in a particular situation. You can see how the 8 minutes and 46 seconds of George Floyd's murder by a police officer instantly breaks open the doctrine of the split-second judgment, of the moment of decision, which has been the whole basis for immunity. For instance, Breonna Taylor's murder in Louisville has been justified fundamentally on the basis of Graham versus Connor, that the police were in a tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving situation. No doubt about it. They thought there were drug dealers in the house, and so they fired over 30 shots into an apartment and killed a woman who was sleeping in her bed. But no worries. The doctrine of the split second exonerates them, makes them immune to the consequences of their actions. So now I want to make a completely anachronistic move, which seems to me, in the spirit of Walter Benjamin, absolutely necessary, and go back to the most classical and traditional Western figures of time, including old Kronos himself, also called Saturn, with his scythe or harvesting instrument, a figure both who cuts the timeline, who is the figure of death, not only Father Time, but Father Death, but also a positive figure of the harvest, of the transformation. Here, portrayed by Romanelli, this painting is in Warsaw, depicting the Titan Kronos, again, wielding the scythe of harvest, but what he's harvesting is his own children. It's as if the QAnon conspiracy is informed by this old myth of Kronos, the devourer of children. Or the most terrifying version of this, Goya's Saturn devouring his children. As the theory went, Kronos represented the destructive ravages of time which consumed all things. So Kronos, one key figure, and there's going to be a trio here. The second member of the trio is Aion, with the cycle of the zodiac, along with Mother Earth, and the four children and the four seasons, the figure of the cycle of time. So line, circle, and point. Kronos cuts the line. Aion guarantees the return, sometimes the eternal return of time. And then finally, the one most relevant to our moment, time as occasion, as opportunity, as event. A strange figure, a youth carrying a razor blade in his hand on which scales are balanced to indicate that this is the moment of decision, the split second, the election, the time when of suspension in the scales, the epoch that will lead to an epochal decision. Kairos is often associated with Fortuna and with other figures of seizing the moment. Certainly, Kairos was provided by the President of the United States to his wealthy investor friends when he gave them inside information about the onset of the pandemic while concealing it from the American people. So Trump himself is a kairotic figure. And I think that's best reflected in Kairos's hairdo. If you look, you'll notice he has a very strange comb over. He has a long forelock and a bald head hidden behind it. The meaning of this, there's an old saying about Kairos that as the opportunity, as the occasion approaches, you must grab it by the forelock, because if it slips by you, you will have nothing to grab hold of. It'll be gone. Kairos only lasts for a minute. And it's that fatal moment. If you let it get by, no chance to catch it. So all of those things condensed in this figure of, in some ways, this is the personification of the present. This is my one joke, my one visual joke for the lecture. Trump raising his forelock rather than his hand to take the oath of office. If only Judge Roberts at that point had grabbed him by the forelock and thrown him down in an act of real judgment, Remember, he lost the election by 3 million votes, but we quite easily forget about that. So I'm coming to the end of my talk now with what you might call the survival of these ancient figures of time, these personifications in the present. And the first is this wonderful composition by the Swiss artist Bastian Oldhaus, who is riffing on Goya and so many other artists, Rubens, who show Saturn, Kronos, the god of time, of linear time, but not eating his children, he's eating the planet and surfing on a tsunami on a clock face. To me, this is an image of what you might call the destiny of white patriarchy, the white father time, father death, the king or sovereign of the world, who is, if unchecked, leading us at considerable speed toward the destruction of the planet with rising sea levels and destruction of the environment. We are literally eating the planet as we speak. And I think everyone knows that has to be reversed. We can't keep doing that because that's the only place we have. But I don't want to end with that. I want to end with something I think more measured, more complex. And if you notice, there are white doves flying in through a cleavage in the sky, some kind of symbol of hope, I suppose, as if this is not all there is to the story. But let me turn to one final image, and then I'll conclude. If I could improve on Oldhaus's image, it would be to replace the white doves with blackbirds singing in the dead of night. The fateful year of 2020 has seen the coincidence of the global pandemic with these revelations of the endemic racism of white supremacy. As the American monuments to white patriarchy come down, what should rise in their place? My candidate is this distinctly anti-monumental assemblage, a miniature memory palace created by Black feminist artist Betty Saar, who lives in Los Angeles. This is a doll's suitcase, and we approach it from the backside, of course. But like Benjamin's angel, its wings are open, but it has eyes in the back of its body, in the back of the trunk, looking toward the future. When you go around to the front of the trunk, the wings of this angel of history show us a pair of small, well-traveled dolls with two heads standing on the top of the trunk, a globe and a clock. And they look back at us into a future we can't see. The trunk may have its back to the future, but it's not going there blindly. Saar's trunk gathers the bodies of the ancestors, which I can't resist calling Father Time and Mother Earth. The bodies are scarred, mutilated, and assembled from part objects, but they are still standing. Father Time, a leather doll whose chest has been etched with the diagram of the human cargo of a slave ship. Black Kronos has not been devouring the planet or his children like the white patriarch of the Oldhaus allegory. Instead, he has been cut off at the knees and maybe decapitated, and it looks as if his feet have been hobbled or replaced by something like birds' talons, as if he is becoming the broken-winged blackbird himself. An impression that's reinforced when you look more closely and see the large feathers that accompany him in the background. Mother Earth, by contrast, is an assemblage of vases and bottles stacked to suggest a faceless but not headless body. Her emblematic attributes are not feathers, but antlers. The one on the left is like a crutch, on the right more like a weapon, and her feet are firmly on the ground, looking up with mojo eyes. If Father Time bears the scars of slavery on his body, Mother Earth looks more like a warrior, her tools close at hand. Sar's work exemplifies, in my view, both the portable and the prophetic character of the Black contribution to our time. Her angel of history carries the past in its body, rendering history and the earth, time and the planet as something that have to be carried, brought along with us, not left behind. And even if we think of the trunk as a kind of pregnant object, to be carried to term. It's an allegory of labor, slavery, and escape from slavery, incorporated in the body of a doll's trunk that is looking clear-eyed toward the future, with eyes on the back of its head and on the feet of Mother Earth, searching for a vision of truth. Thank you very much. Sorry for going on too long, but I'd love to have questions now. So the floor is open for questions.
Thank you very much for a wonderful, very inspiring, very rich lecture that touched on so many different issues. It's very difficult to, with such a large audience, to organize a real discussion, but I will bring you some questions. And I would like to open with one that is a bit like methodological almost, but maybe helps as a beginning. That you talked about the present and images that symbolize the present or represent the present, that catch the present on the one hand, and then referred to basic images that are used throughout history to picture time. So I think that one thing is that we don't know really what's going on, so that we cannot oversee the present and look for images to help us to understand the present, to catch what is going on in that sense. And then there is trying to understand, trying to know what is time as such. And that is also very difficult because we don't know what time is and can only see time as movement or in its effects. How do images function in grasping, understanding what's going on, and versus an iconography of time as such?
I think if you study the whole history of attempts to grapple with the question of time, what you find is discontent with imagery, but then almost inevitably a need to fall back on it, that there is no way to speak of time directly except through figures, faces, forms, shapes. So in one sense, all that I'm doing is trying to eliminate the notion that, oh, there would be another way. We could go directly to time, maybe deep inside computers where the clocks are humming away as we speak. There is some invisible engine or force that if we could only get at it, that would explain to us what time is. I think that's the false direction. I think that's what we need to do is go back to our experience, go back to to history, the historical record, and think about the perception of time, the experience of it in our moment. And in a way, this is a point of view, I suppose, that Walter Benjamin expressed when he wrote Theses on the Philosophy of History. He talked about himself as being like a monk because he was in a state of suspension himself. Rousseau also said something similar when he was quarantined with a virus in an Italian coastal city, that he had to, suddenly he couldn't do anything. All he could do was think. And what he thought of was itself the question of time. So you could say another way to put this would be to say, I'm trying to make the best of a bad situation. Asking, is this a good time to be thinking about time? Shouldn't we be, no, don't think, let's do something right away. Unfortunately, that option is not open. So I think that in some ways, this is the most propitious moment for thinking about the scales of time that go to make up our experience, all the way from the planetary, the longue durée, to the instant of police decision-making, in other words, human time and all of its range of possibilities. Since I can't do anything about it, I can think about it. I can try to bring together images from all times and places in a kind of crazy atlas, a crazy quilt of our moment.
So you would say that in the present moment, like the experience of time that we have in this moment of history, that notion of time is best captured by the notion of danger, almost of Kairos, as a kind of sharp moment where things are at stake.
Yes, yeah, it's that, but it's also a moment when one feels that action, immediate action, is pretty much ruled out. I mean, my own action the last few days has been sitting at the kitchen table with my wife, handwriting postcards to voters in Georgia, all over rural Georgia. There's a theory that the handwritten postcard is much more effective in getting people to vote, getting them to participate in this decision, and that a standard printed out postcard, I hope my handwriting is terrible, but it's in some sense the only thing I can do other than voting myself to have some effect on history. The other thing I can do is my job, which is as a scholar, to be here in my study, surrounded by my books, thinking about what is the total experience of this time. That's why I began with Abby Warburg. Warburg tried to assemble the entire archive of evidence about, what was the Great War and the pandemic that accompanied it, or that succeeded it rapidly. At the minute the war was over, the pandemic was launched. In some ways, a much worse time than ours. But Warburg thought, I must make an atlas. I must bring it all together, try to understand it. That's our job as scholars. And so, in some sense, I'm saying, being a hermit, being isolated in this way, maybe it's, for scholars, a kind of ironic blessing.
Yes. You gave examples of images that for you are capture the present, like the I can breathe, which will stay as an image to picture 2020. But you think that there are images of the future that you see, or that are made, or like the angel of history is looking back, because you cannot see the future, of course. So what you see is the past heaped up as a ruin, and then trying to do something with it. But your peasant, drawn by Crespi, was like half looking forward.
Yes. Yeah, he's twisting in
his horse
his saddle.
also.
I like the image of us ambling on horseback. This is William James's picture of the specious present. We're like on a saddleback, and the past, we can see a lot of the past, especially the immediate past. We know what happened last week. It's partly memory, then it's history. But what about trying to turn in the saddle and glimpse what's coming? It's clear that this is a turning point in the road that we're all mental travelers on. That the world is not going to be the same after this is over. The virus will end. I think we know that. It won't be forever. My mother was also a philosopher of time. When I was a boy and I was complaining that, when are we going to get to go? When is this going to stop? She would say, this too will pass, which always made me angry, but it's true. The virus will pass. It's an episode, but it's a decisive episode. And it's coupled with these other, with the pandemic, with the endemic, which has reached a new crisis in our time. So we know the future will be different. For one thing, I think it's safe to predict that what we're doing right now, talking globally to an audience that comes from all over the planet, that this is going to become much more normal. Why? I would much rather be in Brussels right now, having coffee with you and my colleagues, and celebrating together. I think there will be a time when that can happen again. But we also know that this is, in some sense, a new normal, a new kind of that it won't be necessary to travel the world, pleasurable as it might be. We'll be sitting in our own houses, learning from each other. So a new kind of intellectual academic culture is emerging right in the moment we're in at this time.
I go back to the lecture and pick some of the questions that have peeped up. One question I will read. Okay. How do images fit into your vortex of time? Are they specific to a certain time, a part of the graph? Does the process of iconization, as with the case of George Floyd, make them timeless? Or do these icons become sites of a convergence of time?
Wonderful question. My answer usually to either or, are they this or are they that, is yes. They are this and or that. Images, in one sense, are always timeless. They endure. George Floyd's image will last for a very long time, just as Hobbes's Leviathan did, or the coin with the Roman emperor wrapped in a serpent. But at the same time, they are timely images. They appeared at a time. They have dates on them. They appeared at a moment. This is why on Mi's introduction, she mentioned, I think that images are like living things. I think it's a strong metaphor. They are actually more like viruses than full life forms. If you're going to compare images to living things, they need a human host in order to spread, like viruses. Viruses can't reproduce by themselves. They are parasites. They live on us, in us. So images are like viruses themselves. what you could call pseudo-evolutionary entities. That is, they keep developing, they are evolving as we speak. And this is one thing that makes COVID-19 so deadly. It's not just that it's one thing, it's changing, adapting to the new conditions it finds as it invades human bodies, breathing human bodies all over the planet. So for me, images are the key to understanding past and present, and imagination itself is all about predicting the future, and not just predicting, but also imagining a future that we could create, one in which some of these endemic conditions would be moderated. Certainly the virus of racism is one we've been living with in our bodies on this continent since 1619. This is the new date now. When we say, when was America founded? Was it 1776? That's what I was taught in school. Now we're learning a new date, 1619, when the first slaves arrived in North America.
Okay, then I have another question, more for clarification, from Norm McLeod, who greets you and says, "Hi, Tom." You said, I read his question. You said earlier that time is not constant and showed a few charts to illustrate your point. Physically, time is not constant, of course, but this becomes an issue only a very high speed of light, or at a very small quantum scales. Over the scales, you're referring to time itself is constant. The variation in the chart you show occurs on a non-time axis. I think what you mean is that our perception of time is variable. It varies with our emotional states. Do you agree?
Yes, I do. Absolutely. Everyone, since Bergson, everyone understands that subjective time, but I think it's not just my time, subjective time in a sense of one individual's sense. Of course, we have different time senses. There are people here who are at a different point in the timeline of their life. But we also, we have collective time. This is what, maybe my lecture here is just a symptom of conversations that we're all having about the strange, crazy times, and times plural, in which we live. And that distinction between time as a singular absolute and times as a plural phenomenon, very crucial. We are in both at the same time. The clock may be ticking inexorably, uniformly, at microseconds or split seconds or intervals of 8 minutes and 46 seconds, or weeks, months, years. So, but what we are experiencing of that is both individual, how do I feel today? How do you feel? But then how do we feel? What is the affective temporality of the epoch, of the period, so that we sense what Raymond Williams called this the feeling of the time. He wanted to have a history of periods that was not simply about events, but about experience and affect, the affective temporality that underlies group experience.
Okay, I take another question, and then maybe we could almost close the session. Somebody who says, "Hi Tom, an excellent talk. Would you say that the vortex image is the integration of what Ricoeur calls cosmological time? So how would you relate time as history and time as nature?"
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it looks like in the pandemic, it is time from nature that intervenes in history and
Yeah.
takes over,
Yeah.
so that our notions of presence, presence both as a time, but also as being present, as being something that you can see, that you can relate to. Like the virus, we cannot relate to the virus. So the virus is present, but it's not present for us because we don't know where it is when we walk the street.
Right.
So it is like the time of experience that we try to capture in images and stories clashes with another kind of time that intervenes in a way that we cannot not see.
Yeah, I think the vortex is a good way of imagining, depicting time as not simply an event or a continuum, not simply a period or a moment, but as a convergence of different scales and vectors. So that one thing we see is that natural time, the virus is nature. It's completely indifferent, and it's one of these strange moments when the big agent in history has no face. It's strictly invisible, and yet it is incredibly powerful. And like the old Father Time, I mean, Saturn, Father Time, is the Reaper, the Grim Reaper. So he's, in a sense, that's what I think Father Time was always about. Try to make visible what is this force that is impersonal, that does not care about us, but which we have to care about it. We have to come to terms with it. And the other then is the planetary time, the fact that that we're living in a period that maybe harkens back to the time of the dinosaurs, a great extinction when thousands of species were simultaneously disappearing. This is a kind of Father Time and death, which is not about individuals. It's not that one of us dies, but that the entire herd is wiped out. No accident that people are talking about herd immunity, as that this is the secret plan. The only plan that Donald Trump has is let it go. We're tired of hearing about it. Let it kill everybody. And besides, won't affect me because I'm immune. That's his characteristic attitude. So yes, natural time is bearing down on us simultaneously from two directions. One is the immediate pandemic. The other is the longer term question of species extinction, the realm of climate change. 20, 25 years ago, climate change was in the future. This year, in the midst of the pandemic and in the midst of the uprising of the endemic of consciousness of racism, we've had the most terrible weather, fires burning unprecedented amounts of forest on the West Coast, floods and hurricanes on the South. Chicago sometimes feels to me like the kind of refuge, the still point at the center of the tornado or the hurricane. And I think that's why this feels like a time. There is this metaphor of the hurricane, of having a still center. I think of us as, of our time, my sense of the presence is it's a still center. That's what I meant by the Epoch, the suspension. But it's a still center in which we are observing around us. And it's lucky scholars like us who get to observe it in this way. because I mean, after all, social isolation is our way of life. We do get together for drinks, but most of our days are spent like mine, and you know, communing with the dead. All of those books.
Okay.
I'm happy to take more questions, Bart, if there are more.
Yes, yes, yes. I will read you a last one. I read. The question is, if we speak about white supremacy and racism by using Kronos, Aion, Kairos, and the examples from Western art history only, doesn't this show the supremacy of knowledge systems? We talk globally, but we only use Western knowledge, so it seems. Isn't this exactly what is wrong with the world today? It's a question by Jean Baudon.
I think it's certainly that question is one of the reasons I turned to a completely alternate set of figures of Father Time and Mother Earth to conclude. Bastian Oldhouse's image is a kind of a condensation of why we cannot go on this way with white supremacy, predatory capitalism, unlimited growth, the idea that the global economy, along with the population, can just keep growing endlessly. The planet cannot sustain it. So, and I think of the old Father Time is now updated as Kronos, not just eating his children, but eating the planet itself.
Yeah. But do you think that the Western iconography of time, that it determines our understanding of history and our understanding of what's going on today?
No, it's only partial. And that's again why Betye Sar's Searching for a Vision of Truth was my concluding example of a completely different conception of Father Time and Mother Earth. Mm-hmm. Father Time is someone who's not killing the world, but who has survived, who is an image of survival that we have to carry forward with us. Because that's what ultimately the question for our species is, how are we going to survive what we have done? Darwinism tells us the implacable lesson that there is nothing that guarantees that the human species will outlive these viruses. Mm. The viruses have been around for millions of years. Mm. We're relatively new, young, and now we have rendered ourselves a precarious species. Mm. And one reason why I think of this in terms of madness is basically in terms of the simple legal definition of insanity in this country, which is someone a danger to themselves or others? That's our legal criterion. There's nothing psychoanalytic or psychiatric about it, just a behavioral definition. Under that criterion, the human species is clearly a danger to others. We're wiping out 300 a day, and we are a danger to ourselves. Mm-hmm. So this is the time to take cognizance of that, to make decisions which recognize that as a possibility, that nothing guarantees the continuation of the future we were imagining, say, 2 years ago. We're in a new period now, and with a new future that has to decenter that old Father Time of white supremacy, of rapacious capitalism, and the Black Father Time and Mother Earth. They are like totemic figures we could carry with us into that future.
Okay. Okay, but even before there were viruses, I think Kronos castrated his father, and so separated Mother Earth and the sky, and created the space where we live.
Yeah.
Where
Yeah, all these
our-
legends come back to us now. You know, all of the mythologies of time, I think, are somehow.
Okay.
Nietzsche was right. We come in a circle, we come back to them, but they're different, and that's why it's a spiral and not just a closed circle.
Okay. I think it's time to conclude that we came to the end of this event. I would like to thank you all for being with us, all in the audience. And I would like to thank the staff of the Academy, Professor Hilde van Gelder, coordinator of this Thinkers program, and especially, of course, our guest, Professor Mitchell, for his wonderful talk. Thank you.